one of the major issues was what would be the reciprocal tariff level.
I don't think it was a coincidence that it came after the big agreement between India and the EU.
My understanding was that the Indian government and the Indian people had been reducing their purchases of Russian oil, and that issue was manageable.
Our purchases of oil from Russia may come down because of market conditions. We will certainly not take it to zero because the US is asking us to do it. It just makes sense.
We've built up over 25 years of very durable bilateral partnership. This may be an historic agreement that ends up being, in my opinion, a win-win for both countries.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Tracking Trump on DeKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. Well, the big story of the week is that there is finally an India-US trade deal that has been announced after months of hard-nosed negotiations from both sides. The strange thing, though, is that we don't actually know the finer print of this agreement just yet. India says the details are still being worked out, so we can expect a joint statement with those details in a few days from now. But whatever we have heard about this trade deal so far has largely been from the United States, from President Trump, his White House spokesperson, who claim, amongst other things, that India has agreed to stop purchasing Russian oil. It's going to buy oil from America and perhaps Venezuela instead. That India is going to be purchasing $500 billion worth of American products over the next 5 years. And that India will have zero tariffs on American goods that are imported into India. Now, none of this has been confirmed nor denied by the Indian side. All we have heard Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal say today is that the interests of farmers, the dairy sector, the agriculture sector are being protected. He hasn't gone on to elaborate on that or say anymore, but this is, of course, a politically sensitive issue here in India. So there is a big question mark on what exactly India has agreed to as far as the agricultural sector is concerned in particular, whether India is actually going to stop purchasing Russian oil altogether, although the purchases are significantly down. But there is a bigger question here. One is, does this trade agreement, which has come, as I said, after long-standing negotiations, does it actually help to repair that strain in the India-US relationship that we've seen over the past year or so? Or is it going to take a lot more to bridge the trust deficit? Before I introduce our two distinguished panelists today, let's just listen in to what the White House spokesperson has claimed on what India has agreed to and what the Commerce Minister said in his statement.
India committed to not only no longer purchasing Russian oil, but buying oil from the United States, also perhaps from Venezuela too, which we know will now have a direct benefit on the United States and the American people. And in addition to that, Prime Minister Modi committed to $500 billion of investments into the United States, including for transportation, for energy, and for agricultural products as well. So this is another great trade deal.
भारतीय पक्ष अपने संवेदनशील क्षेत्रों, विशेषकर कृषि और दुग्ध क्षेत्रों के हितों की रक्षा सुनिश्चित करने में सफल रहा है। अमेरिकी पक्ष के भी कुछ ऐसे क्षेत्र थे जो उनके दृष्टिकोण से संवेदनशील थे। लगभग 1 वर्ष तक चले कई दौर के विचार विमर्श के बाद दोनों वार्ताकार दल द्विपक्षीय व्यापार समझौते के कई क्षेत्रों को अंतिम रूप देने में सफल रहे।
And joining us today, two distinguished diplomats who know the India-US relationship better than anyone else. Ambassador Arun Singh was India's ambassador to the United States in 2015. He joins us from New Delhi. Joining us also is Ambassador Ken Juster, who was America's ambassador to India from 2017 to 2021. And he joins us from New York City. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us today. Ambassador Arun Singh, you first. Just to take a look at the announcement itself, were you surprised that it came at this particular time, and did you think it was a coincidence that it came just days after a big agreement announced between India and the European Union?
No, so I don't think it was a coincidence that it came after the big agreement between India and the EU, although everyone was surprised by the timing. because from all indications, broad parameters of a trade agreement between India and the US had been agreed to by July last year. But for political reasons, I think the US did not accept the agreement that was out there. There was some sort of difference between the two governments about the role that the US may have played in the ceasefire in the context of Ops Sindoor. And clearly, US President was not very happy about that. So that was one. Second, at that time, the US was getting very favorable trade agreements from countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, EU, and still imposing 15-20% tariffs on them. So the kind of unilateral gains he was making in those trade agreements was not that something that he could project in the context of India. So he didn't agree at that time. But I think what happened was that when we did the India EU FTA, there was a sense in the US that they could not push India any further. And if the US did not move away from the current position, then European manufacturers, European economic entities would get an advantage in the significant and growing Indian market compared to American interests. So that was one. Second, if you remember when the Prime Minister had gone to China for the SCO summit, the optics of his meeting there with President Putin and President Xi has played out very badly in the US for President Trump. And there was this whole argument was whether the US was losing India to Russia and China, and President Trump himself had commented on that on the social media. So I think that with these two things, especially with the India-EU FTA, perhaps they felt that now was the time to move to the next stage in terms of the trade agreement. So certainly it was not a coincidence, but the timing certainly nobody knew exactly when it would happen.
Ambassador Juster, do you agree with that assessment about the timing of this, and how important was it to have some sort of announcement at this time, given how strained the relationship has been?
Well, I appreciate what Ambassador Singh has said, but I have a slightly different view of it. I think it is correct that the parties have been negotiating really since the Prime Minister visited the United States in February of last year. And unlike a lot of the trade agreements that have been announced, or the deals, which have had 2 or 3 page summary term sheets, the United States and India were actually negotiating deeply substantive provisions as the first phase of what ultimately, hopefully, is going to be a free trade agreement. So that took time. There was a sense that the parties had reached an agreement in the summer of last year, but as Ambassador Singh said, at that time, several other agreements were coming across the desk of the president with more favorable terms, so they went back to the drawing board to make some adjustments, and then the Russian oil issue also arose. My understanding was that the Indian government and the Indian people had been reducing their purchases of Russian oil, and that issue was manageable. I think one of the challenges was that by making it so public on the United States side, it made it more difficult for India to publicly do this as opposed to quietly do this. But I think there was a process in place to eliminate that 25% tariff. On the reciprocal tariff, the final really major issue, and there still are a few details to be worked out, but one of the major issues was what would be the reciprocal tariff level. And that's an issue where the parties still had a bit of a gap to bridge. And I've always felt that it would take a phone call between the two leaders to close the deal. And that did take place earlier in the week, and the agreement was finally reached. Again, with a few provisions to be worked out. My understanding, for example, is that going to zero on tariffs in India relates primarily to industrial goods, where they'll virtually go down to zero, maybe not all the way, and that the sensitive agricultural issues are left for a future phase in negotiation. There may be some non-controversial agricultural issues where the tariff rates go down. But I think more than anything, it was getting a new U.S. ambassador out to India to help facilitate the dialogue, and really created an opportunity for the parties to say, let's get this done and put it behind us. I don't think the United States felt that India was going to somehow move away from the U.S.-India relationship toward China. I think the prime minister wants stability in the relationship with China, and he would have been going there, whether there was a trade agreement or not, to the SCO meeting to maintain that relationship. But I think no one is under any illusions that China and India are suddenly going to become close partners. I mean, China killed 20 Indian troops in 2020, and I think there's a real big trust deficit. And then on Russia, I think there is an understanding that it is declining as an economic power. India's had a long historical relationship with the Soviets and then the Russians, but they had never purchased large quantities of Russian oil prior to the war with Ukraine, and I think can adjust downward. How quickly that happens and how completely, I think, is still a little unclear in my mind. But so all of these forces were coming together. But I think as much as anything, the president and the prime minister have always been exchanging pleasantries, have always said, we want to get this done. And finally, they made it happen. And, I think it'll really accelerate other elements of the relationship, which have been moving along nonetheless, despite the strain in the trade area.
I think, though, that what is unusual about this announcement is the fact that, as we've all spoken of, is that there is actually we don't know the contours of this deal, what the details are, and the fine print does matter. And Ambassador Arun Singh, I think the question on a lot of people's minds is, would India really open up its agriculture sector even partially to American goods? Isn't that a politically hugely sensitive issue? The Americans claim that's happening. India's not said anything on that. Will we completely stop buying Russian oil? Are all indications pointing in that direction anyway? We don't even have a budgetary allocation for the Chabahar port in Iran this time. So there seems to be a perception being created that India is coming under American pressure on these fronts. How do you see it?
So I'd say we should not speculate without all the facts coming out. And second, the fact that not enough information has come out is not unique to what has been announced in the US-India context. When US did its trade agreements with the European Union, with Japan, with South Korea, it was of a similar nature. And they've been saying what they are doing is a framework agreement first, where the broad parameters of what kind of a trading and economic relationship they want to build, what will be the level of the reciprocal tariff, and after that they go into finalizing the details and the terms of the transactions and trade that will happen. So it happened in the other cases, and I think something similar is happening here. Now, as far as the Russian oil purchases are concerned, Nidhi, you'd recall that till 2022, we hardly bought any oil from Russia because the market conditions didn't suggest that it was better for India to buy Russian oil. After that, Russian oil was available at discounted prices. And whatever India bought from Russia was within the framework of US and European sanctions. They didn't say don't buy from Russia. They said buy within a price cap. And that was what India was doing. In fact, the then US administration was publicly encouraging India to buy more Russian oil because they said that will keep global prices stabilized. So that was going on. So I think India's approach has been that you buy from wherever is available at prices that work for India and for India's energy security. Now, with more alternative oil coming into the market, India would have to look at the competitive advantage of different sources of the oil. And recently, for example, what we were buying from Russia has come down from 1.8 to about 1 million barrels a day. So I don't rule out that some of what we may be buying from Russia because of the market conditions may come down. But I don't think India's approach will be that we will stop buying from Russia because US is asking us to. Because it doesn't make sense for India to put all its eggs in one basket. Because US itself has shown that it can be a unilateral, it can be a coercive power, and therefore India has to hedge. And Russia has traditionally been.
But doesn't it look like India is coming under some American pressure on this? It can't be a coincidence that Russian oil purchases are going down, obviously preempted also by American sanctions on companies, and therefore that really limits the options for India's refineries. But also the Chabahar port, as I said, no sanction in the budget for that, which has been an important strategic project for India. So when President Trump claims that India will now buy from America or Venezuela, I'm asking you perception wise. It doesn't seem to be a very good look.
You know, it may not be a good look, but you have to look at the facts. And eventually, the US, like any other partner, will try and convince you of what their perspective is and if you can look at their interests. But eventually, India looks at its own interests, does the cost benefit analysis. And in terms of the cost benefit analysis, it does not make sense for India, given the kind of relationship we have with Russia, to do something related to Russia because US is asking you to do. But if the market conditions work in a certain direction, then of course. But the same doesn't quite apply in the case of Iran. Because if you see the kind of economic, trade, defense cooperation partnership that we have with Russia, it is of a very, very different level with the kind of relationship we have with Iran. So, in each case, the Indian companies involved have to make a cost benefit analysis that if you are exposed to US sanctions, where many of them might be looking at funding opportunity, raising finance, or looking at buying equipment from there, how does it work out if you continue dealing with entities that are under US sanctions? And once you do your cost benefit analysis, you make your own decisions looking at your interest. So I think I would say that while our purchases of oil from Russia may come down because of market conditions, we will certainly not take it to zero because the US is asking us to do it. It just makes sense because if you're seen as caving in on an area of major interest to you, you'll expose yourself to further pressure on other things. Similarly, on agriculture, from all what has come out in the public domain, because official facts have not yet been stated, that in a couple of items in the agriculture sector where there is a shortage in India and it is of export interest to the US, perhaps there could be some accommodation of US interest. But in the overall agriculture sector, opening it up completely where there may be a broader US interest. I think that's not going to happen.
Ambassador Juster, though, when we look at the level of tariffs, India's tariffs are going to be slashed, as President Trump says, to 18% now. And when you look at India's neighborhood and our immediate sort of competition, it's less. We had the highest tariffs at one point, but it's still quite high. And there is also that element of unpredictability with President Trump. I mean, look what he did to the South Koreans recently. So how do we navigate this unpredictability?
Well, a few things. First, let me say I agree largely with what Ambassador Singh has just said, and it's not always necessary that every I be dotted and T be crossed for the leaders to say we want a deal, and then for the parties to finesse some of the details going forward. And I think again that this has been something that will be hopefully a win-win situation for both parties. Now, in terms of the tariff rate, it is true that this rate may be higher than existed previously, but as you said, for countries that export comparable goods to what India exports, these are countries largely from South and Southeast Asia, India is lower. It may be that somebody who's purchasing the good wouldn't buy it at a higher price, but if they're willing to absorb it, India's will still be a relatively lower, higher price than that of other countries. So it should give India an advantage and continue to allow it to maintain most of its market share. So I think that's the logic behind the tariff rate. And as I mentioned, because this is the first phase of a broader potential agreement, it gives India an opportunity to further lower the tariff rate as future phases are negotiated and other concessions may occur. And again, I agree with Ambassador Singh that the agricultural area is recognized in every country as a especially sensitive area. And so while there may have been some concessions in areas that are not controversial, and the controversial ones, I think that's really going to be put off to the next phase. Now, the final question you asked is about the unpredictability, and that's an element of dealing with President Trump. And I think the important thing to do is not get affected by some of the rhetoric at that level, but to really focus on what's occurring on the ground and not to have to challenge every pronouncement that may come out of Washington, but to work closely with India as the United States, as the two countries have done over the years, on substantive, tangible accomplishments we can make across the board of the relationship. In the defense area, we've continued to move forward. In technology, I've been involved in several track two dialogues, and the private sectors are very active in the energy sector, in healthcare. I can go on space and other areas and pay a little less attention to some of the rhetorical flourishes and more to the shared interests our two countries have in moving forward. And my final point would be, I think reaching this agreement should hopefully facilitate a Quad summit hosted by India, in which President Trump can travel to India and really further invigorate the bilateral relationship.
Which does bring me to my next question that you partly addressed, Ambassador Juster, which is about the bigger relationship between the two countries. And you're right. I mean, there is so much commonality, shared values that continue, and cooperation in all the sectors that you listed out. But at the same time, there is also a trust deficit that has crept in. The fact that President Trump has gotten much closer to Pakistan over the last year, as you know, especially after the Pahalgam terror attack in India, has not gone down well in Delhi. The fact that today you have Indian student admissions down by more than 40% in American universities because they feel it's a very unwelcome environment. You have Republican leaders targeting the H-1B visas and a sort of a racist backlash against the Indian American community as we speak. So these are things that have put a considerable strain. And is it going to take a little bit of time to repair that?
Well, let me disaggregate some of what you've said. Some of these issues are not U.S.-Indian issues. They're simply how the administration is conducting its policy. And I would point to H-1B. I'd point to student visas. These affect the world. They have a significant impact in India because of the number of students come or people who get H-1 visas, but they're broader issues, and there are debates within the administration on both sides of them. We've seen the administration's policy on H-1B shift a bit from time to time. Secondly, I don't buy the trust deficit issue. The commentators talk about that, but we've built up over 25 years of very durable bilateral partnership. There have been incidents on both sides where one could say, wow, how could they do that? Or how could this one do that? That happens. President Trump viewed this as a trade issue. One may like it or not like it, and he has a set of tactics that you may or may not appreciate it, but it was not a policy decision by the United States after a 6-month interagency review to change our position vis-a-vis India. And even though the United States has had a warming of relationships with Pakistan, that does not affect the U.S.-Indian relationship, and no one in the United States views those countries on a par or hyphenates the way they work. And just like India has a very close relationship with Russia, it doesn't mean that the United States suddenly can no longer trust India. You have to be a big player in international affairs and recognize that a stable Pakistan is probably in everyone's interests as well. So I say all these things to emphasize that the U.S.-Indian relationship has been and is in good shape. There's no doubt there's some collateral damage from what's occurred, and more so in the minds of some than others. But the fact that the leadership and the governments kept talking and working across all these other issues and now have closed the gap in trade, which has always been a difficult issue in the bilateral relationship and always been a laggard relative to others. This may be an historic agreement that ends up being, in my opinion, a win-win for both countries. I think India lowering its barriers to trade and opening its economy unleashes your world-class companies to compete effectively on the global stage and will be better for your economic growth and prosperity. So again, I know the commentators have talked about the trust deficit. I think that's a little overly dramatic. I know there's issues related to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I don't think anyone in the United States views that on a par with the U.S.-Indian relationship. And I think it would be a mistake to get distracted by that any more so than it would be for the United States to get distracted if Prime Minister Modi hugs President Putin.
Well, Ambassador Arun Singh, do you agree with that? Do you think that the trust deficit issue has been overstated, as Ambassador Justice seems to think, or are you more cautious on that front?
So, Nidhi, while I agreed with much of what Master Justice said, on this, I'd be a little more cautious. Now, before that, a couple of things for us to note. Even while the trade disagreements were continuing, several major US companies announced fresh investments in India. For example, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon announced more than $35 billion worth of new investments in India. So they remain focused on the India economic and technological partnership. The second, even while the trade disagreements were there, both the governments made a determined effort to keep the relationship as stabilized as possible in other areas. So the defense dialogues continued, the dialogue at the level of the foreign secretaries continued. Our defense minister signed with his counterpart in October the third iteration of a 10-year framework agreement for defense cooperation. Whatever we wanted to buy from US in defense, which was of interest to us, those discussions continued. So in all other areas, the elements of dialogue, elements of discussion continued because they wanted to keep the relationship stabilized. But that having been said, it can legitimately be argued in India that US policies change from time to time. They change from one president to another because each president tries to show that he has a different set of priorities, different way of dealing with things. Now, when those policies change, they are going to impact on us. Now, because of the size of the US economy, the size of US role in the global context. So you need to hedge against those changes to protect your interests. And so diversification of relationship, hedging against the deepening of the US relationship, all that will come in a more reinforced way. And certainly, I think it can be legitimately argued that with the consistent building of the relationship over the past 25 years, which had consolidated at an accelerating pace with each new incoming president, including during Trump 1.0, when the Ambassador Justice was the US ambassador, that took a hit. Now, when that happens, everybody has to be prepared for the fact that there can be changes. Now, when there are changes, how do you protect your interests? You do it by hedging. And it is Russia, it is Europe, it is France. These are among countries that provide you that hedging. So I think that argument will certainly play out in India in a major way.
Well, it'll be interesting to
Can I,
see. Yeah,
can
yes,
I just add one thing? Again, there's no doubt that there is some collateral damage whenever there's a significant disagreement between the two parties, but I do think the relationship is strong enough to continue to move forward by and large. I go back to 2008. I've worked on this relationship for 25 years, and we concluded the landmark civil nuclear deal, which is one of the major high points in the bilateral relationship, and where the United States moved heaven and earth to help India overcome some of the world reservations relating to its nuclear program. Part of that deal was that India would purchase 6 nuclear reactors from the United States, but soon thereafter it enacted a civil liability law that precluded that happening up to this day. Someone in the United States could say, boy, that's a trust issue, but we pushed forward and we recognized that other issues come up and that's part of a mature relationship. And I really feel we're going to do the same in this instance as well. And I appreciate the hedging points and the strategic autonomy, but I think at the end of the day, when you step back and look at the core interests that the United States and India share, that's what's going to drive this relationship going forward.
well, we'll wait to see what the fine print of this trade deal is as well. I'm sure that it will continue to make headlines both in India and the United States. Very good to have spoken to both of you today, Ambassador Justice, Ambassador Arun Singh. Thank you very much for joining us on DeKoder.
Thank you very much.
And we'll be back next week as the details of the trade deal are unveiled. See you then.